Hello and welcome back to Contentious, the podcast from Radix Communications. This is the lightly delayed episode 5. I don't have a good reason for the delay beyond we've been having a little heat wave that I'm sure everyone's heard everyone in the UK complaining about, and something about shutting all the doors and closing all the blinds to get on a podcast video has not been very appealing. But we are back. We are in the seats, the blinds are drawn, the lights are on, and we are here to talk about the things that matter to us, to our clients, hopefully to you in content. I am Katy. This is George. Welcome back, George. How do you feel in your second go around on the podcast?
Feel energized after the last session. It's been a while since I've heard myself speak, so I was a little bit horrified at my performance last time. But I've taken notes. We're going to come back bigger. We're going to come back stronger. We're going to come back with a smoother voice, maybe. I don't think so. But anyway, yeah, I'm looking forward to having another run at this and having another great discussion about the wonderful world of content.
It's very good to have you back, and yet nobody really likes the sound of their own voice. So I am
in
right
my head,
there
I
with
sound
you.
like Barry White, and in person, I sound significantly less like Barry White, unfortunately. So sorry, everyone.
I'm definitely a lot more nasal than I was expecting. So I apologize to people for that. So to do our usual of concluding our last month's topic, we were talking about the mixed potential, shall we say, of using AI to help marketers hit growing and sometimes ludicrous goals for content production volumes. George, you've been thinking quite a lot about this. You recently put out a newsletter that also touched on this topic. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts for us before we head into this month's feature topic?
I'm glad you asked, Katy, because yes, I do have some closing thoughts, and you, the listener, will be pleased to know this isn't another excuse for me to go on about a rant about AI. In this particular instance, I think my thought has been more about the role of content in marketing writ large, because obviously content marketing itself, at least in terms of how I've seen it throughout my career, has gone through quite a lot of ups and downs and how budget's been allocated to it, right? Like I feel when I first started my career in the early 2010s, it was kind of the new thing and loads of people were really excited about it and putting a lot of money behind these big hero pieces they wanted to promote and going all in on them. And then I sort of felt it took a nosedive in 2016 with all this sort of geopolitical and economic uncertainty going around. It really took a hammering and loads of content was just getting left off, not done, not finished, not promoted because people just didn't feel comfortable allocating a lot of budget to marketing at the time. And then obviously in COVID, when lots of other marketing forms became really difficult to do in the pandemic, content just went crazy. And so now with this period, obviously, the role of AI is having an impact on how people can produce content at scale, I think. But I wonder if maybe it's just a sort of another part of the sine wave where we're just in a bit of a lull. People are sort of a bit unsure about how businesses are going to go. We're obviously seeing loads of layoffs in tech companies at the moment still. So I wonder if there's just a lot of uncertainty. So who knows? Maybe this whole thing isn't some sort of technologically driven change in content, and it's more just riding the sine wave. Maybe in a couple of years, we'll have another event that sees content get a huge amount of interest and budget behind it once more. We'll see. So I guess I've come away with a more slightly optimistic view that this isn't some sort of downward trend where we're just going to keep being expected to do more with less, and it's more maybe a little patch and it'll swing around. It always does, right? That's just the nature of economics. So anyway, not to say the whole conversation was pointless. I'd like to come back to it again because I think there are lots of smart ways you can stretch budgets further in content. But yeah, I don't want to come across as all doom and gloom about it either, But yes, I think the role of content is shifting definitely. And I was thinking about a piece I'm working on at the moment about promotional content to support things like events. I think when we think of content marketing, especially you and I as copywriters, we think about these big white papers, big ebooks, but the reality is lots of written words are needed to support all sorts of business functions across marketing, sales, etc., etc. And a lot of that is underpinned by things that aren't content, like say messaging. And that's my really horrendous segue into the meat of our discussion today, Katy, because I know you were telling me that you've been speaking to a lot of potential clients about messaging recently. You've had a lot of inquiries about that. And I know you've had a lot of thoughts about it. So I'd love to hand it back over to you for a little bit of a messaging preamble.
Mate, only episode 2 and you're already so smooth on the transitions. I love it.
That is the roughest segue I think ever, but we're going to go with it. I won't edit that out. We'll just leave it
I really
as
like
it was.
it. I really do.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it has been so far a bit of a summer of messaging, which is very lovely. I think, obviously, we're copywriters. We love writing. You can stick me in front of a 3,000 word white paper any day and I'll have a jolly old time. But there is also quite a lot of the slightly more strategic work around the edges that we like getting involved in as well. And messaging seems to be on the top of everybody's minds at the moment. like you said, lots of inquiries, lots of actual work. I've been doing messaging workshops and setting those up and running those and all that kind of stuff. And it's got me thinking about the cadence of messaging and how it serves you over time and how you can come back to it and refresh and review and that kind of thing. Often messaging reworks are spurred by significant change within a business. You acquire somebody, you rebrand, you release a big new flagship product, that kind of thing. They all precipitate some quite dramatic changes in your messaging. But I don't necessarily think that messaging is something we should be leaving for the big seismic changes. I think there's probably an argument to be made, and I will attempt to make it, for a sort of regular program of reviewing and refreshing, because the longer you leave it, the bigger a project it becomes. So I think, if you think about the way language drifts over time, people start calling things by different names, that the sort of culture around a type of technology or a type of product changes. If you aren't doing that regular look back at your messaging, you can kind of miss where things have diverged from what you've put together and what you've had approved. So I think regular small reviews and refreshes can help keep your messaging current. And I think there is a way to do that without just essentially having to have a constant eye on it. I think there is a middle ground between constantly thinking about almost nothing else and leaving it until it's a big, scary, looming project that no one really wants to get into. But yeah, George, do you agree? There's some eyebrows.
So I'm gonna say I feel sometimes that the name of this podcast being contentious. I think the worry for me is always that, like, if we agree, it's sort of is false advertising. There's no contention here. It's just two people slapping each other's backs, agreeing all the time. No, I don't necessarily disagree. I know I was actually thinking more about, I guess, where this idea of messaging being this like big bang piece of work comes from, because obviously, as we discussed, I think a lot of it will depend on what's triggered the messaging requirement. If it's just like, okay, our brand has a new product, we're going into a new region, then there's obviously like new stuff you need to think about. Suddenly you need to sort the messaging for something new. That's obviously a very clear trigger. You need to do this work and might require quite a big effort to think about a net new way of looking at a product in a new market. But I was also thinking maybe it's kind of coming from another direction, because often, at least from my experience of doing messaging, it's a call with like multiple people involved. You'll have guys from sales, you'll obviously have marketing people, you'll have a lot of product people as well and technical experts involved to kind of get that part of the messaging down right. For clients I've worked with, just that effort of getting half a dozen people in a room who often have very senior job titles, very busy people, immediately makes this a big job. You need to like really think about how you're going to do this. You need to plan it well in advance to make sure you can get that availability with people. And suddenly then it becomes like, okay, if we're going to go through all this effort to organize all these people, we're not just going to do like a 500-word messaging document, right? We want to do all of it. We're going to completely change the message. So I wonder if it kind of almost that's what makes messaging such a big deal as well for some companies. And I guess my question to you would be like how you see a sort of smaller form of messaging work happen. Like, does it need all these people? Does it need this kind of workshop driven approach?
Yeah, I mean, fair point. It's an undertaking to get everybody you want to have in a room, or everyone who wants to be in that room. There is sometimes a difference. Sometimes people who want to be involved in messaging are not necessarily people who need to be there, but you want to keep everybody happy. You want to maybe smooth the path a little later down the line. Sometimes you've worked on something for a long time, you put it in front of legal and they shake their head. And you think maybe we could have averted this earlier in process.
Yeah. So I'm curious actually to add on that point. Who do you think are like the core people that have to be there for messaging to work?
I think you kind of need a sacrifice from each kind of major pillar, I guess, of your business. And I think there's a scale question for sure, because, in smaller businesses, you can probably just get away with talking to, your head of marketing and your head of sales, because they'll have a lot of really close oversight of the discussions they have, how they want to present themselves, these kind of things. I think in bigger businesses, you do need to have somebody who can be the conduit, let's say, for the thoughts and input of a broader team. And in some businesses, that will just be marketing and sales. In some, you will probably want some product people in there. But I think you can also have a little bit of pre-work, because I do think the workshop is an important component. I think talking it out is really vital for this. And I think having somebody, like me, for example, or like George, as your kind of your guide and your sounding board makes that a much more valuable exercise. So I do think even in these smaller situations, I think a workshop is the way to go. That doesn't mean I think you need to be having, 10 hours in a conference room with an M&S lunch delivered, although I do like one of those from time to time.
What, the lunch or the event specifically?
One makes the other better. We'll leave it there. I think you can do quite a bit of light pre-work if you were worried about getting, for example, a technical perspective in, but you don't necessarily want a bunch of technical or product people in that final discussion. You do some groundwork with a standardized set of questions about their corner of the business. What, for example, if you have a range of products, what does your product do? Where does it sit? How do you talk about it? This kind of thing. Where does what you say about it regularly diverge from what's written in this document? Because that's a lot of I think the interesting conversations I have with people is that their messaging is often pretty good, pretty okay, pretty representative of what they'd like to be saying. Whether that is translating into conversations people are having, content people are producing, your website, all this kind of stuff, that is a slightly separate question, right? You could have the best messaging document in the world, or at least the most accurate messaging document in the world, and it might still not get used in quite the way you want it to. So
this is a really interesting point, actually. So the thing about the messaging document for me is, like, I've always wondered in my head, okay, when I've done this work and I've sent a messaging document to an organization, how often is that actually being used? How broadly is it being used? And for how long? I kind of imagine there's like a halo effect where for like maybe the first couple of weeks, people are like excited, like, new messaging document, I'm going to talk to a customer. Let me see what's going on here. And then like months down the line, it's probably just languishing in a file system somewhere. If that's me with my cynical hat on anyway. So I wonder, like, in terms of where the additional value is, because I guess when I've done this work and it's been that kind of classic messaging workshop with like loads of people in a conference room, the people I've worked with, and I hope they're not just being polite and nice. I hope they genuinely think this. They've all said to me like, oh, actually, even just getting everyone together and having this discussion about who are we talking to, what are their needs, how do we address those with our products, and how do we build the messaging around that. They found that conversation really valuable, and that might not have happened if they didn't decide, right, we need to do this messaging really work. And then the document is just the formality. And I guess if you're not going to have that really big meeting and you're going to kind of find these ways to slim that effort down, what else can you do to ensure that either that messaging document delivers a ton of value, or that like it's supported with other things? Like, do you think you kind of need to almost do like a demo piece of content to be like, okay, here's how you can translate this messaging into something like an ebook or whatever it's going to be, that's going to show what the messaging looks like in practice? What else can you do, do you reckon?
Yeah, that one's really interesting, because I do think your success with a document is directly proportional to the quality of the document. And I'm sure we've both seen many over the years that are a little bit lackluster or kind of user unfriendly, things that kind of look good and are detailed. Some of these I've seen like 5,000-10,000 word documents, really hefty, like you've got to be putting hyperlinks on your contents page sort of documents. I think what you produce out of a messaging workshop of any size, if you're doing one of those big overhauls where you're writing things from scratch, you're interviewing customers, you're doing something from the ground up or completely overhauling it, or if you're doing something a little bit smaller that's more of a review and refresh situation, we've got to get away from the urge to always produce a big messaging document at the end of it, right? Because it, like you said, it feels like the proper thing to do, but sometimes it is more of a formality and therefore does not get used. I think being more flexible in what you produce out the other end of a messaging workshop is really important. Some of them will want that big document, and so often you can start with that big document and kind of work outwards, right? And it's a little bit dependent, I think, on what your trigger was. So some people do go into a messaging refresh because they're going, the thing we think we should be talking about and the conversations that salespeople are actually having are two very different things. In which case, what you want to be producing is sales enablement support, right? Like well-formed answers for people that they can just lift and learn or copy and paste and be confident that they are answering the right questions, but also still adhering to the party line. The idea of doing an example piece of content is really good, particularly if the urge for messaging is that it's not coming through in your content.
When we're talking about messaging documents, I appreciate I've been a bit silly in kind of addressing it as if it's some static thing. The messaging document, everyone knows what a messaging document looks like. And actually, now that I think about it, well, there's definitely some core modules that you have to have in terms of like statements about solutions, proof points to back it up, probably a bit about your audience, which is a really big topic we'll go into another time, I imagine. But you were talking about almost like the need for it to power sales enablement in some cases. And I've definitely done a few messaging documents where it's almost been like a telemarketing script where you have like objection handling and, frequently asked questions and common answers literally in the messaging document. But obviously that was based on just a specific request from one client. And I guess I'm just curious at your perspective from the messaging you've been doing recently around like, do you think there's certain things that are like really good to have in a messaging document like that, like little extras, things you would consider core to the experience of delivering good messaging?
Anyone who has ever worked with me will know that I am obsessed with the concept of a toolkit. Like I love it. I will suggest them to all clients as things you can offer to customers as like useful bits of content. I love practical things that have value beyond you read something for 10 minutes and then you never think about it ever again. I love a checklist. I love something modular. This also tips over into how I think about messaging documents because, I think there are probably some core things that are sort of immutable, even if you don't change them between messaging documents. Like, you think about your core value proposition, that might be something that's really stable in your business, right? Particularly for long-term incumbents that have got a really stable customer base of people who come to them for a very specific thing and they do it well and it's all good, but they still want something fresh and something engaging around it. So your core value proposition might not change, but I think that always needs to sit at the top as the figurehead of it, right? Like, it's the thing that all things fall out of. But beyond that, I think those of us who are running these kind of sessions, and marketers might want to do this kind of stuff in-house, but I think it's good to get a neutral third party involved. Our job is to kind of do that exploratory work at the start to work out exactly what's useful to go into it. So, for example, objection handling. I've recently done quite a lot of fresh persona work, and like you said, we will come to personas in a later episode, I think, because there's a lot to say about those and I don't want to derail us. But if between setting up your main messaging you've maybe brought in different audiences that you want to talk to, or you want to explore the possibility of talking to different audiences, that's a good opportunity to do that. Proof points, collecting really good customer quotes as well, because they can kind of get lost in your case studies and your video testimonials, something like that. Having somebody to go through and pick out the really good lines and like not just things that are obvious. So one of the things I did recently in messaging document was I went and found a quote that backed up every single one of our claims.
Nice.
So you could always have one paired with it, because it would be really nice to have a stat attached to everything. Not everybody has that kind of information. Not everybody's service is really set up for that kind of proof point.
Yeah.
Social proof is really nice. So
I really like the proof points thing broadly as well, because I've done a few ones with clients where like you said, this business was not set up for stats. It's just not that kind of product they were dealing with, right? And also they didn't have loads of case studies because they weren't a massively established organization. And it was interesting, the proof point, though, because we did come up with loads of really good ones where there were things about like specific accreditations they had that could speak to the security of their solution, and the amount of customers they had could speak to the fact that it's widely used. Just things like that. I think that there's a lot of proof points to support these claims that do exist. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of needling for people to go like, yeah, actually, we've been in business for like 60 years, so we're probably doing something right. You can pull on some stuff like that, I think, to back things up, which is quite nice.
Yeah, using those kind of numbers in different ways as well. Because like you said, business that's been around for 60 years speaks to its longevity, of course, but then you can also zero into your pedigree through changes you've weathered, very specific events that you've seen and dealt with, like this kind of stuff. And like you said, the number of clients you have can be impressive just from the virtue of, look how many people trust us with this thing. But then if you can split it out into, well, we have incredible, industry penetration with this specific sector, because look at how many people we have in this sector. You can kind of chop and change quite basic numbers into something useful in your proof points, I think. One thing I also wanted to call out, which I did for the first time in the most recent messaging project, which was a suggestion from my client. So thank you, Faye, if you happen to be listening. It's the idea of a kind of short roadmap. So my thinking, to kind of go back to how regularly should you be looking at your messaging, I think setting yourself a semi-regular cadence of at least checking in on it, even if you don't do any work on it, is really valuable. And I think one thing is also when you do come to a workshop, or you might just sit down for it for a couple of days yourself and go through it and look at the differences between the way it's written and the way your company actually talks and kind of reconcile those things. But having a roadmap for, we know this is coming down the line. So a product change, a new feature, any of these kind of potentially disruptive or messaging altering events that are coming down the line, you set a course for yourself where you go, this is good now, I know I'm going to want to look back at this. Or you might go, well, we're going to try and get into dentistry later on down the line. So we know we're going to have to come back and do at least some work for that sector. Even if we do nothing else for the rest of our messaging, it's just, we'll do a really hard focus on that in 6 months' time.
What do you think is a good cadence for checking in on messaging? Should this be a yearly exercise? Is this a once every couple of years sort of bag? What do you think?
I think your minimum should be yearly for the check-in. And I think having a bit of a checklist or a tick list, whatever you want to call it, a little sort of self-questionnaire for what would be my triggers for then going deeper and deciding that this needs work. Your mileage may vary enormously on that. So I don't know if there's necessarily a neat little list that I can give to people. But, if you look at it and you feel that your content is consistently using the same messages, you talk to your salespeople and you see that reflected in the conversations they're having, kind of like an opportunity to just check in with all the people that are using it and should be using it. Are they using it? How well are they using it? What's missing from it, if anything? And that can be a message in a sort of nebulous sense, or it can be, what we're talking about having useful things that come out of a messaging document. It might be that a salesperson goes, I'd really just loads of people are asking me about what our AI features are. That's not necessarily reflected in the messaging that we've already got. What can we say about it that we're happy to say about it? Or, what am I allowed to tell people about our roadmap for the product? That kind of thing. If you're in a really fast moving business, you probably want to be thinking about it more frequently, but you probably just are naturally. But like I said, the check-in does not necessarily mean you've got to sit down and schedule a workshop and bunker down for a whole lot of work. It's just a really nice opportunity, I think, to make sure you're happy with what's in front of you and make sure other people in the business are happy as well. Because, you might have new marketing people that have come in, new writers, new product people, all this kind of stuff. Their opinion matters as well. It might be that they have something fresh and new and useful to add to it that you didn't have when you last looked at it. I think that's it. Do you think it's a longer process, or am I just being really picky?
No, I think you're right. I mean, this is the thing. I guess a yearly check-in makes a lot of sense, and often probably for a lot of companies. I mean, like you said, it depends on how quickly your industry moves. I guess for a lot of people though, that yearly check-in will just be yep, still looks good. HR software is still looking after people. It's some types of tech products that are fairly set in what they're doing. But I guess, if you're an AI startup, probably in a year's time, the kinds of things going on in that industry is going to be really different, I imagine. So you may need to check in more frequently and probably do the work as well. Whereas for a lot of people, this doesn't mean every year you have to corral everyone into a workshop. This just means every year you have a look at it and go, this is still fit for purpose. And
you might have a half-hour call with some people to check in. I think the stability of your product and the demand for your product and that kind of thing is hugely dependent on what kind of industry you're in and all that. But we shouldn't let stability give you a full sense of security, right? Things can move on without you necessarily realizing. Things can slip, language can drift, and obviously you don't want to be changing things, tiny things all the time. To borrow an example from our friends in design, when the BBC updated its logo and it's barely different. We know quite a lot of work will have gone on behind the scenes, and it's not necessarily as simple as they changed a font and charged them £500,000. But you want to feel like anything you do change is having a useful impact, and it might be that you go, this isn't perfect, but it's still fit for purpose until I want to check in again. And, is this, say you get to your year check-in, in the next 3 months you're launching a product and that will have its own messaging attached to it. Do you then go, once we've launched that, we'll look at our holistic messaging and decide if there's anything that needs to change to accommodate that new stuff? There are so many variables to it. The structure, I think, will be really dependent on the setup of the business and the marketing cadences and all that kind of stuff, which is deeply unhelpful, and I apologize.
Well, I guess the tricky thing about this is if we talk about it in the abstract, it's difficult because, the needs of all messaging jobs are going to vary wildly, the nature of your business, the size of it, the scale and everything. Which actually gets me onto a question I was going to ask you, because I appreciate, have we gone through all the main topics of this discussion, or was there any other bombshells you want to drop for us, Katy?
No, I think that sort of sums it up. Obviously, there is the whole messaging workshop itself, but we have recently refreshed our blog on that, and we will share a link to that. So that kind of answers those questions. And what I hope this does explain is why, if you do come to me or Radix in general with an inquiry about messaging, this is why you get slightly frustrating, vague answers until you get on a call with us. Because, this is the downside of things being bespoke,
Yeah. And with that in mind, actually, to avoid us talking in generalities about the messaging, I wanted to hit you with some rapid fire questions about specifics. Now, obviously, I know we're NDA'd up to the nines, so we can't necessarily go too deep, but I was curious if, in your experience working with clients on messaging, if you had any specific anecdotes from work you've done about things that worked really well or were really interesting to engage with, different approaches that suited a particular client. Anything you want to share around that, I think would be really cool.
That's really interesting. I think this is not necessarily from anyone in particular, but it's from 10 years of being involved in these. Is the most important thing, I think, when you're setting up a workshop, when you're actually trying to get people in the room, is to be quite firm about who is in there, that kind of thing, and to set expectations about people's involvement and what comes before and after in terms of prep and follow up. Because more than once, you've seen people who want to be involved in the process, they're involved in the workshop, and then you realize they're the busiest person on the planet, and getting feedback is really, really tricky. We've talked about something similar, in our SME guide, because people are busy, but it's a really important thing for people to carve out time for. So you need to kind of set expectations around that really clearly, I think. For me personally running these things, resisting the urge to have a really templated approach.
This is the issue you were saying about this, the problem of being bespoke, is it has to be to suit the different needs of a business. Because if a client comes to you and they're in a very different stage, if you go in treating like a massive established enterprise as a startup for the purposes of messaging or voice and tone, it's obviously just not appropriate. It doesn't really work. So there's lots of considerations there. And I think, as you said to your point, Katy, it's a very strong one about like who you get in the room. I think also shapes the way those discussions go out too. So there's an element of both like setting the expectation to get the right people in that conversation, and then that allows you as the person delivering that workshop to really cater to specific roles and kind of get the most out of them.
Yeah. You also just make sure you have enough people to manage the room as well. Like when you get into big groups, the one we did recently was literally we outnumbered the number of people that we were speaking to, because it was one of those kind of mini refresh things, and they had everything we needed to hear. But some people, you might end up with 20 people in a room. Making sure you have kind of provision for those people to be heard and engaged with properly. What you don't want is somebody feeling like they didn't get what they wanted, or they didn't contribute in the way they wanted, because that leads to a different kind of disengagement after the fact. And it can make it really hard to get more input later or sign off and things like that. So making sure that whoever's running it has a good handle on the structure and management of the day, I think, is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think actually, like, it's a bit of an odd thing to say, but I think sometimes this process is quite emotional for people. And I don't mean as in like they're suddenly in tears because they realize their messaging isn't appropriate for a new region they're entering or anything. But I mean, like, people are emotionally invested in the way the business they work for presents itself.
Yeah,
and I think this is the same thing we see with web copy projects, right? Where people are like really serious about the feedback on those, because it really matters to them. It's how they show up in the world. And the same thing with messaging. I think people really care about it, which is great. But I think it means you need to carefully manage stage to make sure everybody gets a hand in that conversation. Otherwise, I think they can feel a bit left out, and that's obviously not nice for anybody, right? And it means you can miss good input as well. So yeah, there's a reason why facilitation is like a whole discipline, right?
Every new messaging workshop brings an unexpected challenge for you to manage. It's, not unusual for somebody to have big clashing opinions in that room. So there's sometimes a little bit of de-escalation and conflict management involved. In our ideal world, everyone comes relatively on the same page already. But like you said, people feel very strongly. And if you've got a lot of sort of reasonably, not necessarily siloed, but kind of lightly separated business units that are used to kind of managing their own product, managing their own sales, that kind of thing, there's like an element of sort of defensiveness and making sure that they're heard and represented properly, because like you said, is a sort of a thing that you hold some emotional weight with, because it's the thing you do all day every day, and you want to make sure that everyone gets it. And that's really valuable, I think, to make sure everybody feels heard. It's almost like therapy speak at this point.
Yeah, I want to. Speaking of, I'm going to end on a clanger of an anecdote that hopefully will wrap this episode up on an amusing and, in my case, slightly embarrassing note. Long ago, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I did a messaging workshop, and it got quite heated between a couple of different departments who were really looking at this differently, and they just could not agree. And me being an idiot early 20s guy, eventually we got to a point where I was just like, I'm not mediating this, I'm not going to be able to Montague and Capulet these two together. We just need to bounce. So I kind of just left it with like, I'll let you sort this out offline. I'm just going to continue with my questioning. And I did come off the back of this thinking like, that was the only option I had. Like, I don't know how I would have resolved there, because it was one of these just like two completely divergent opinions. They were never going to be able to compromise or merge them, really. But I was like, man, this client is probably never going to forgive me. I imagine they're going to be cursing my name under their breath for a long time. They did actually invite us back for more workshops later on down the line when they had other needs. So clearly I didn't do that much damage, but that did make me laugh, and I feel bad about that. So if you recognize yourself in that story, I'm sorry, and I hope you can forgive me one day for not addressing the conflict. I was young and didn't know what to do. I'm sorry.
I mean, sometimes the most powerful thing is knowing your limits and knowing what can be resolved with your input and what's best resolved not with your input.
Thanks, Katy. I think that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me, and the truest thing.
Well, we'll conclude George's therapy session for the week.
Yeah, please do. I look forward to next time. I'm over time already. I'm going to have to pay extra if we keep going, aren't I?
Well, thank you so much, George. It is great to have you back, and we will be back next month with a new topic. But in the meantime, we will be putting out a poll about messaging workshops and about how often you guys reflect on your messaging, because I'd really like to know if this is something that I have completely pulled out of the ether, or if people are thinking about this as much and as often as I think is probably good. But we'll see. You might tell me that I am just trying to make more work for people, which is possible.
I find it even more funny if everybody responds and go like, yeah, we think about it every 6 months, and we've just spent like 40 minutes talking about something that like everyone is totally on top of. And so if you want to prove us wrong like that, then be my guest. I think that would be an entertaining follow-up to next episode to catch up.
Yeah, I'm always willing to be proved wrong. So please let us know what you think. We will see you again for another episode of Contentious. Thank you very much, and goodbye.